All right.
It's just like me going through a third of the Republic in one single car ride.
We didn't do Timaeus today, but that should be exciting for next week. I woke up at 8 o'clock, couldn't fall back asleep. Anyways, let's go ahead. Actually, hold on 1 second.
That's good. At least you didn't sleep. What?
Wants to come in the room.
Oh, that's a wonderful.
Really is a woman. This cat is really. Whoops. Okay.
How's your cat a woman? Explain.
I'll cut all of that out. All right. I just put her on the bed so that she'll shut up. Oh my god. All right. There might be some meowing. Okay.
I don't know. Keep it in. I'd say it will be cute.
It'll be unavoidable.
And your female audience will appreciate it.
The female audience will. And then I'll rope them into you guys. So.
Female audience.
Hidden benefit of joining my server. Yeah. Hello, guys and gal. Actually, that. Anyways, let's go ahead and pick up where we left off 3 weeks ago. And we did a little bit of a review, which will not be posted because that will be redundant for the YouTube. But we're going to pick up at the introduction to SCSPL. If you hear the cat in the background, you'll be fine. It's an added benefit of listening to this. All right, introduction to the SCSPL. And remember, that's the self-configuring, self-processing language. According to the reality principle, the universe is self-contained, and according to infocognitive monism, it regresses to a realm of nil constraint, unbound telesis, or telesis, or UBT, from which it must refine itself. According to the telic principle, which states that the universe must provide itself with the means to do this, it must make and realize its own choice to exist, by reason of its absolute priority. This act of choice is identical to that which is chosen, i.e. the universe itself, and thus reflexive. Give me 1 second. Okay. The cat changed her mind. All right, so this is already a little bit easier than the last set. But let's keep reading before I choose to comment or not. Thus reflexive, i.e. existence is everywhere the choice to exist. So kind of an isomorphism between agency and the action of agency, seems like. Although choice to exist, what exactly that means, not clear to me yet. Accordingly, the universe must adopt a reflexive form in which it can self-select for self-defined existence, with a selection function identical to that which is selected. This means it must take a certain general or initial form, the MU form, which contains all of the requisites for generating the contents of reality. Due to hology, whereby the self-contained universe has nothing but itself of which to consist, this form is self-distributed. Okay. One might at first be tempted to object that there is no reason to believe that the universe does not simply exist, and thus that self-selection is unnecessary. Okay, I'm going to keep reading, but then I kind of want to make a comment about what exactly is meant by existence here. However, this is not valid. This is not a valid position. First, it involves a more or less subtle appeal to something external to the universe, namely a prior external informational medium or syntax of existence. If such a syntax were sufficiently relevant to this reality, i.e. sufficiently real to support its existence, then it would be analytically included in reality, as defined up to perceptual relevance. Okay. Second, active self-selection is indeed necessary, for existence is not merely a state, but a process. The universe must internally distinguish that which it is from that which it is not, and passivity is ruled out because it would again imply the involvement of a complementary active principle of external origin. So I don't think maybe it would be a bad interpretation to assume that his meaning is choice to exist in its most primordial form, because if you could make the choice to exist, that would assume that you already exist to make that choice, but he's saying that that is kind of isomorphic. But maybe he means more in the sense of like phenomenal reality existing as something in particular rather than existence as such. Um, that's my thought so far, but I'm sure it's
I
already getting
mean,
clarified a
also,
bit.
couldn't you say that even if you don't have a choice to begin to exist, right? You have a choice if you're going to continue to exist.
Yeah. But even then, I would say we would have to have like some kind of um, mechanism behind this like secession of existence, because the like primary on the primary level of reality, it would be hard to describe how something might cease to exist, but maybe phenomenally, like if you were to change significantly tomorrow, you'd kind of be existing as a different state or condition of person, or teller in CTMU terms. But yeah, let's continue on. By the principle of linguistic reducibility, reality is a language, because it is self contained with respect to processing as well as configuration. It is a self configuring, self processing language, or SCSPL, whose general spatio-temporal structure is hologically replicated everywhere within it as a self-transductive syntax. This reduces the generative phase of reality, including physical cosmogony, to the generative grammar of SCSPL. This reality generative grammar is called, what is that, gamma grammar, and the MU form, being the most general or prior form of reality. Okay, I like that. By the principle of infocognitive monism and the hology of MU. And does anybody remember? Because I don't think he's using MU as the M equals U, mind equals universe. No, because that's M equals R. Does anybody remember what MU? Hold on a second. Real quick. Real quick detour. CTMU, MU. Multiplex unity. Okay. Multiplex unity. Let's get a quick review of that. Why not? Very general philosophical principle of the CTMU. In essence, it states that reality is consistent in the sense that it is stable with respect to the laws of perception and cognition. So the multiplicity is consistent with the unity. Oh, nope, not that. Not that. Nope. Okay. Okay, so and the MU form, the multiplex unity form, being the most general or prior form of reality, is its basis. By the principle of infocognitive monism and the hology of the multiplex unity, SCSPL consists of MU configured infocognition, and gamma grammar describes the generation and transformation of this universal constituent. So I'm assuming the significance of the MU configured infocognition is that there's this kind of distribution of that primary level through the multiplicative level, or the level of multiplicity, i.e. the unitary is present, distributed, pervades the multiplex. Anyways, SCSPL is not an ordinary language, and gamma grammar is not an ordinary generative grammar. The reasons come down to the inherent limitations of computational language theory. In standard computation theory, a language consists of the set of strings accepted by a given automaton or class of automata. E.g., a language L is called regular if there is a finite state automaton that accepts it. However, this approach is inadequate for the SCSPL. First, it centers on computation, a general type of information processing associated with an abstract automaton. The Turing machine, or universal computer, that could never have generated the informational structure of the real universe. Oh, I kept reading like that sentence would go on. Okay. Being an informational and meta-informational, i.e. syntactic construct, the universal computer can itself account for the genesis of neither syntax nor information. Okay, interesting. Be cool to see where he's going with that. Second, unlike ordinary languages, the reality language cannot rely on an external mind or automaton or pre-existing hardware substrate for recognition and processing. Since any processor real enough to recognize and process reality is necessarily part of reality, the language processor distinction is without ontological force. Okay, so that's all just to kind of identify their isomorphism, i.e., the language is that which is processing. So, i.e., self configuring, self processing. So, it's more like the way I describe something similar with even like the monad and the indefinite dyad, or how you would situate the indefinite dyad, or that just the general indefinite aspect of reality into the one, even, is that it would be kind of like the way it is something prepossessed by the more primary principle. But if we were to say, suppose that like this universal mind is an agent, and it in fact is existent, then it would have a way that it is, and that language, as far as I'm reading this, the language would kind of be like the way it operates. And this wouldn't necessitate, like, if you have something that is and it has a way that it is, there's no reason to like arbitrarily separate those into different ontological stages. So I like that, actually. That's really good. Thus, while ordinary discrete models of reality rely heavily on the language processor distinction, SCSPL incurs no such debt. For example, cellular automaton models typically distinguish between a spatial array, the informational objects existing therein, and the distributed set of temporal state transition rules by which the array and its contents are regulated. In contrast, SCSPL rewards language and processors as aspects of an underlying infocognitive unity. By conspansive, i.e., ectomorphism, endomorphism, duality, SCSPL objects contain space and time in as real a sense as that in which space-time contains the objects. Okay. Resulting in a partial identification of space, time, and matter. SCSPL is more than a reflexive programming language endowed with the capacity for computational self-execution. It is a proto-computational entity capable of telic recursion, and thus of generating its own informational and syntactic structure and dynamics. Whenever I see matter in like more modern stuff, because now my brain's on like Platonic matter, which is pretty different from the way like modern physics uses matter. But I'm assuming he means more like the modern physics, like a stuff-based matter. Anyways, whereas ordinary computational models are informational and syntactic in character, the proto-computational nature of SCSPL requires a generalization of information and syntax with respect to the origin or ultimate nature of perceptual reality. Explanation is a reductive/inductive process that regressively unbinds constraints in order to lay bare those of highest priority and generality. This process eventually leads to the most basic, intelligible descriptor that can be formulated, beyond which lies only the unintelligible. This marks the transition from information and syntax to a convergent, reductive generalization, telesis. Okay, so telesis is marked by... One second. Okay, actually, sometimes you just gotta read on. Uh-oh. This points to a universal property of language. It is dynamic. While it is often conveniently assumed that languages are timeless, Platonic ideals that waft around waiting to be processed by external acceptors, they can be treated in terms of static information only by users or processors that provide them with an external transductive syntax. Only then by neglecting certain underlying necessities. For example, to physically realize the informational structure of a language in a printed or electronic medium, it must be expressed in terms of physical particles that dynamically recognize each other's location to the extent required to maintain the spatial relationships comprising its informational structure. This is a general requirement, extending from the physical and concrete to the mathematical and abstract. Thus, languages are ultimately self-processing. They must either contain their processors in their expressions or be expressed in terms of a more basic language fulfilling this requirement. Accordingly, the expressions of the SCSPL are dynamic informational configurations of information processors, implying that SCSPL everywhere consists of information and acceptive transductive syntax in a state of logical intersection. Together, information and syntax comprise infocognition, self-transducing information in the form of SCSPL, syntactic operators that cross-absorptively communicate by acquiring each other's informational states as cognitive syntactic content. It is to the common basis of these two components that information may be reduced in the SCSPL context. Where the term telesis denotes this common component of information and syntax, SCSPL grammar refines infocognition by binding or constraining telesis as infocognition. Okay, so what I'm kind of curious about is it seems like he's implying that the almost very, or at least very basic languages that reality operates on are actually malleable themselves. But now I'm thinking that that's because there's a peculiar kind of isomorphism between that language and the expression can change, therefore the language itself must change, but it would make sense that at a more metastructural level, it would always remain the same. And I think he did mention that point a while back in the text. I could be wrong. But because I remember clearly it was some like little text about the CTMU. I think it was on the Facebook group where Chris said that he said people question like what the coding of a chair looks like, what the code underlying it in this kind of language would look like, and he said it looks like the chair, like it is the chair. But if he didn't reconcile that in a reality principle that metastructurally is consistent and coherent, that would be a little bit odd. Like the fundamental way that the language would have to operate would have to remain the same, and it would just have to already allow for that kind of permutation.
If I can just quickly chime in, I think a point of it as well is that the only way we can at least perceive that form is as a chair, right?
Right.
If we think of other things, right? Like for example, how do you see sound? Well, then you take the waves, right? And then you have to tell that to, look at there's the sound in a visual form. However, there's really no way you could do that with like the form, from what I'm aware. I don't think you can do that, and therefore the only way we can actually perceive that form is through this proxy of the actual chair being there.
Right. Yeah, and you guys can chime in whenever you want. Yeah, that's interesting. Sometimes reading these, I'm trying to balance taking a moment to think about it with being prompt here, but it tends to build on and explain itself sometimes. Sometimes it just gets a little bit more complicated, but anyways, this points to a wait, did I already read that? Yes, I did. Yes, okay. To the extent that any grammar functions by the recursive application of syntactic rules, SCSPL grammar is recursive, self-calling. However, SCSPL grammar is not merely deterministically or non-deterministically recursive, but telic recursive. While an ordinary grammar recursively processes information or binds informational potential to an invariant syntax that distributes over its products, Gamma grammar binds telesis, infocognitive potential, ranging over possible relationships of syntax and state, by cross-refining syntax and its informational content through telic recursion. Telic recursion is the process responsible for configuring the syntax content relationships on which standard informational recursion is based. Its existence is an ontological requirement of reality. The telic recursive cross-refinement of syntax and content is implicit in the seed of gamma grammar, the MU form, which embodies the potential for perfect complementarity of syntax and state, law, and matter. Okay. interesting. I feel like sometimes reading this, you get it at a deeper level, but then putting it in your own words becomes really difficult because it's like it's a little bit deeper than discursive perfection of understanding. Um, this or since this potential can only be specially or specifically realized through the infocognitive binding of telesis, and localized telic binding is freely and independently affected by localized, mutually decoherent telic operators. Deviations from perfect complementarity are ubiquitous. SCSPL evolution, which can be viewed as an attempt to help this complementarity emerge from its potential status in MU, incorporates a global syntactic invariant that works to minimize the total deviation from perfect complementarity of syntax and state as syntactic operators freely and independently bind telesis. So, a global syntactic invariant. Wait. Should be viewed as an attempt to help this. All right, so that'd be kind of like a default coherence. I'm assuming not something that would have to emerge, and that's just referring to something else. Something that would be default that would basically make it so you can't actually deviate from that complementarity or that coherency, since they would be, the things in question state syntax. The SCSPL would be part of like a totally coherent system. Anyways, let's see. This primary SCSPL invariant, the telic principle, takes the form of a selection function with a quantitative parameter, generalized utility, related to the deviation. The telic principle can be regarded as the primary component of SCSPL syntax, the spatio-temporally distributed self-selective choice to exist coinciding with MU. Okay. Real quick, let's get ourselves a reminder. It's always good. Self-select for its existence. This is caused by definition. There's nothing outside reality that is real. Therefore, everything within reality needs to sustain and explain itself, must come from within. This is kind of odd because I don't think it would have to be an outright choice to exist. I think there would be no alternative because that would just be concept reification of non-existence. But this principle makes a lot of sense for defined reality specifically, which I think should rightly be identified as posterior to primary reality, since it's consistent, but it's not eternal. So, for instance, like defined reality as in phenomenal, informational, pre-informational reality shouldn't really have. Then again, it kind of depends. Some people use reality specifically to refer to like phenomenal reality, and real as like objective, like an objective in the sense of object, external. And CTMU might have been written to kind of appeal to that. I'm not sure. Anyways, I just read this. Okay. SCSPL incorporates the concepts of syntactic stratification and syntactic distribution. For example, because the laws of mathematics everywhere apply with respect to the laws of physics, the former distribute over the latter in the syntactic sense. Thus, where the laws of mathematics and physics are denoted by S1 equals LMS and S2 respectively, S1 distributes over S2, i.e. forms a syntactic covering for S2. Essentially, this means that the laws of mathematics are everywhere a required syntactic component for the language of physics, or of the language of physics. With S2 is associated an SCSPL sublanguage called L subscript O. L subscript O constitutes the world of perception, the classical objective universe of sense data traditionally studied by science. Okay. Interesting. Okay, so kind of like these laws, more fundamental laws in reality distribute over the sub-languages, more primary languages would distribute over smaller posterior languages. Okay, world of perception, classical. L underscript O is contained in the telerecursive pre-informational phase of SCSPL, kind of because it would have to be implied by that. Like preceding reality would have to be implied by the prior antecedent reality. Interesting. Pre-informational phase of SCSPL. Okay, so that's kind of key. There is a pre-informational phase, LS1, which encompasses the cross refinement of L subscript O syntax and L subscript O content from the pre-infocognitive aspect of SCSPL. The part of SCSPL grammar confined to L subscript O incorporates certain restrictions to which L subscript S is not subject. E.g., the grammatical portion of L subscript O S2 is fixed, distributed, and supposedly continuous, while that of L subscript S can be mutable, local, and discrete. In a word, telic. Okay. Gamma grammar is the generative grammar of SCSPL equals L subscript S, and this is like affects itself as this, right? Or is this sideways U? What was that again? Does anybody remember? Mal.
Yeah, no, I have not used that in math thus far in my year.
Ah,
No, it's
Karnik had it.
well, I will not dox myself by telling me what my math course is. That's I've
Yeah,
already done that too many
yeah.
times. You
Don't do
won't have to
that.
edit.
It took me 5 minutes to edit that out. Um, let's see. Okay. Gamma grammar is unlike an ordinary grammar in that its processors, products, and productions coincide and are mutually formed by telic recursion. Okay, so I'm assuming it's kind of a posterior grammar because it's mutable. It seems to be mutable, so kind of like a language like the one that would be incorporated in like our everyday experience of reality, because it would have to change to allow for change. Kind of have to change. It'd almost be like a language. The idea I'm getting from this so far is that a language that forms and contains and prepossesses all possible permutations and by default allows those permutations. Yeah, so that's, I mean, that makes perfect sense with multiplex unity. So I think that's so far really great. Syntax and state loosely analogous to form and content, or productions and products, are mutually refined from telesis through telic recursion by infocognitive processors. Production rules include the telic principle, distributed elements of syntax formed in the primary phase of telic recursion, and more or less polymorphic telons formed by agent-level tellers. The corresponding modes of production are global telic recursion, informational recursion by distributed syntax, and local telic recursion. So, interesting. So it seems like, I think he did mention earlier that more local telic recursion would, with its proper scale in mind, affect this kind of global recursion and self-selection. Not that it's the only thing doing that necessarily, but yeah, that makes sense. The words produced by gamma grammar are not strings of symbols, but L subscript O spatial relationships among parallel processors that can read and write to each other's states. In effect, the states of its processors are roughly analogous to the symbols and strings of an ordinary language. The processors of gamma grammar thus function not only as transducers but as symbolic placeholders for observables and values. While their external states correspond to products and their state transitions realize the productions of grammar. Okay. The processors function not only as transducers but as symbolic placeholders, and the external states correspond to the products. Okay, so kind of like an external informational state that you might be inhabiting, like who you are, what defines you. as the product of a kind of language. Is that someone else or is that me? You guys still hear me?
No, I can't hear you.
Okay, good. I just have to check after that one hang up, that one time. Anyways, actually it did happen today, so. In other words, the states and state transitions of the processors of gamma grammar comprise a representation of gamma grammar, rendering SCSPL a dynamic self-modeling language or interactive self-simulation. In the following description, products are limited to the physical end products associated with L subscript O. This is in no way to be interpreted to mean that only SCSPL products are physical products, or that the only SCSPL products are physical products. In fact, everything in SCSPL is to some extent a telic recursive product of everything else. Okay, that sounds a little Leibnizian. I like it. However, where the primary explanandum is physical, scientifically observable reality, L subscript O is an appropriate choice. Okay, let's see. Now, just as a warning, okay, a caution sign, I'm not going to be able to explain all of this perfectly. This looks like it's going to get a little bit complicated, but let's go through it anyways. Gamma equals O, R, P, and mu contains 1. A set of O of active reflexive. Okay, so this is going to kind of break down gamma into different variables. Okay. A set of O, I keep misreading that. A set O of active reflexive objects, including gamma itself. The processors reducers of gamma. All processors are capable of and responsive to informational deterministic recursion. O includes a distinguished set of sigma equals gamma A Q of syntactic operators, coherent processors capable of or responsive to telic recursion. Okay, so let's just take that as syntactic operators, a set of syntactic operators, coherent processors. Okay. In general, the parts of SCSPL syntax active within a given operator depend on its specific type. Sigma includes a global processor, gamma, the set of Q equals Q subscript I, of reducible and irreducible stable particles that are responsive to telic recursion in a degree proportional to their freedom and coherence. And the set A of telic agents, active telic recursive operators or tellers capable of expressing teleology on the local level. Elements of A need not occupy L subscript O, but may exist in L subscript S, where U, I think that's like upsilon, denotes the generalized self-selection parameter of gamma. The elements of A are required by gamma as internal upsilon responsive sensor controllers. And apologies if I get some Greek a little bit wrong. Okay, so it contains active reflexive objects, including the language itself or the grammar itself, and they are responsive to telic recursion, proportional to freedom and coherence, and the set A of telic agents. So responsive to telic agents. Okay. So I'm going to take that as like sets of information, reflexive objects. But it could be more metastructural, but still responsive to tellers. Okay, let's just keep going. A set of R equals R subscript O, R subscript S, of products containing a subset R subscript O equals sigma subscript O, tau subscript O, pi subscript O of L subscript O. Product states including all of the relations of L subscript O and a subset R subscript S of telons or pre-made or pre-products. Okay, product states. Okay, maybe what I described for that one is actually more like this. and the objects are more like metastructures. Let's see. Generated in L subscript S by telic recursion associated with global or agent level syntactic operators. The elements of sigma subscript O are spatial relations, those of tau subscript O are temporal relations, and those of pi subscript O are spatiotemporal relations. Okay, so R equals spatial, temporal, and spatiotemporal relations as product states. That makes sense, right? So a product state would have to have like a spatial state relaying some kind of spatial quality or condition, temporal condition, or at least an object that would render as these three things. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense. Spatial temporal relations. Okay, are spatio-temporal relations. Pi is the spatio-temporal relations containing both spatial and temporal relations. Okay. Sigma consists of relations of states regarding which the corresponding transducers have no mutual input. T consists of sequences of consecutive states of single objects. And pi consists of processes or combinations of both. So I'm assuming they have no mutual input, and that's why it's registered as discrete in space. Temporal makes sense because sequences of consecutive states of those objects, and pi consists of the processes because the process would be spatiotemporal on the whole or combinations. Okay. These states are not in general fully determined by L rules of state transformation, but require telic augmentation for for actualization. So that's, I just want to double down on that because we can kind of understand that one a little bit better, is part of the generative grammar, gamma grammar. Okay. 3, a set P equals NT, consisting of productions of gamma. N consists of the distributed descriptors of the spatiotemporal relations, including the spatiotemporally distributed Markovian and conservative descriptors called laws of physics, while T consists of active L subscript S entities analogous to those of N, but associated with specific telons preproducts from R subscript S. So, wait a second. Okay, so telons as preproducts generated in LS. Okay. Preproduct also kind of sounds like something similar to like a Platonic form, like a way that reality is that informs actual products, which would, in like Platonic sense, be kind of like permutated combinations of forms. So like a white t-shirt would have multiple forms. I'm not entirely sure that's what he's getting at with preproducts here. And telons, but it kind of sounds like he uses telons the way Platonic forms are also used. So anyways, with specific telons, preproducts from R subscript S and subject to coordinated local variation in the context of high-order telonic relationships, the elements of N are determined in the primary stage of telic recursion, while those of T are determined in the secondary stage of telic recursion. Okay, so let me take 1 minute here. Okay, N, distributed descriptors of the spatiotemporal relationships. Okay, while T is active entities analogous to those of N, but associated with specific telons. Okay, active entities associated with specific telons, and those are in the secondary stage, while the distributed descriptors of the spatiotemporal processes or relationships is... Oh, well, those... Okay, so he says, like, laws of physics. Those are in the primary stage. Okay, we kind of get that, I think. After number 4, if anybody wants to, input on any of these, it's kind of... Yeah, it's kind of dense. 4, a starting configuration, the MU form mu. So multiplex unity form, and he's going to use mu for that, which is identical to the telerecursion event which creates it. The inception of SCSPL and gamma grammar is a telerecursion, not an informational algorithmic recursion. Okay. It is this identity of event and outcome that determines the innate spatial and temporal characteristics of spacetime for which mu is the seed. The mu form can be regarded as an intrinsic perturbation or intrinsic asymmetry in the UBT, which is unbound telesis. The mu form is distributed over the SCSPL. So a lot of this mu is very relevant because of the presence of the unity in the multiplex, i.e. the primary in the posterior, and this kind of isomorphism between, a lot of this is an isomorphism between like the process of something and the product of that thing. So like the language of, I don't know, this phone in my hand coming to be, being in a sense, in a kind of real sense, I guess is the idea I'm getting here, is identical to the product itself, i.e. the phone. And that, was that? Yes. Okay. So, and again, gamma is referring to a kind of grammar of the SCSPL, if I remember correctly from just a couple minutes ago. And that contains all the things we just went over. Any comments from just those four specifically? Have a drink of water real quick. Okay. And mu would be the seed. Okay, and that unity multiplex isomorphism seems to be kind of seeding or extending itself to the event outcome isomorphism or sameness. Anyways, a processor of a grammar G is any natural or artificial dynamical system that operates, changes state, or processes information in conformance to the rules of G. Unlike ordinary generative grammars, gamma grammar requires no external processors. Its processors and productions are identical. Thus, gamma grammar is executed by its own productions in levels of syntactic distribution, ranging from the global to the object level. In fact, O, R, and P processors, products, states, and production events all coincide and thus exhibit a form of triality. This three-way coincidence is a characteristic of gamma grammar and captures many of its essential features. Okay, so I do kind of like this trinity of basically product, producer, and the operation of production in a sense, because the production as an operation would have to be what the producer does, and the product would have to be contained by it. I am a little bit skeptical of maybe this is a bit of a misinterpretation, but I'm a little bit skeptical of reducing either the product or the operation of production to the processor or the producer, because at some level it seems that a kind of primary agent has to be prior to like preceding or posterior reality, and if that is the case at the higher levels of reality, then you'd think that multiplex unity would make that correspond on the lower levels, but we'll continue on there. ORP coincidence is already to some extent realized in the standard language grammar processor model of computation theory, but only inadvertently. While linguistic processing is dynamically paralleled by changes in the internal and external states of processors, The processors are still considered separate from the language and grammar being processed. Moreover, the basic medium of processing is not considered. The model is not self-sufficient, and recursion is merely informational and computational. There is no allowance for infocognition or telic recursion. The SCSPL shares none of these limitations. Gamma grammar generates SCSPL according to the utility of its sentient processors, including the self-utility of gamma and the utility of its L subscript O relations to tellers in A. I almost wish when he continues to reference things later on that he would just write it out each time instead of using a variable. Or I guess not a variable, but like a letter to stand for it. Anyways, gamma and A generate telons on the global and local level respectively. So telons being these kind of subscription objects, so the grammar would be generating that, as would the utility relations to tellers. Okay. Thus, they may be capable of recognizing and maximizing the selection parameter upsilon. In the case of human tellers, for example, this requires the QPS and ETS components of the HCS. Good thing I remember what all of those stand for. As such, they are responsible for telic recursion and may be regarded as the generators of gamma grammar. While the set Q of elementary physical objects are freely and competitively acquired by telons, and thus occupy an ontologically secondary position. Okay, hold on. Responsible for telic recursion, generators of gamma grammar, while the set Q of elementary physical objects are freely... Okay, so the physical objects acquired by telons are secondary in position. Okay, that makes sense. So you'd have like a more primary, more consistent language, and then the secondary language, if he would divide it up that way, probably something similar to that. Be secondary, more permeable or mutable. All right. Gamma grammar is conspansive. Non-global processors alternate between the generation and selective actualization of possible productions, and thus between the generative and selective, i.e. inner expansive and requantizative phases of conspansion. The selection phase of an operator coincides with interactive mutual acquisition events, while the generative phase coincides with the generation and selective actualization of possible productions through hological multiplexing. In conjunction with extended spatiotemporal superposition, conspansion provides the means for local, telic, and informational recursion. I'm actually not 100% clear. Like, conspansion makes sense, the idea of a contraction with being kind of isomorphic to expansion. But how this is tied into recursion, I'm not 100% certain how that is. I will look into that later. Conspansion is a global process which cannot be locally differentiated as to rate. Its rate is thus a globally invariant time-space conversion factor. And because all changes of local state must be expressed in terms of it, it is maximal. This invariant maximal rate of production is referred to as the rate of conspansion c and can be physically identified with the speed of light in vacuo. The implications of the constancy of c and n in light of the metaphysical ontology principle have already been noted with respect to internally apparent accelerating expansion of the global operator. Okay, so maybe it's because conspansion would be caused by it, but no, because he's saying conspansion provides the means, but maybe more of an explanation for why local recursion could happen. Or, because I was thinking of it as a consequence before. Not clear to me. Okay. Let's see. It is thus... All right. Down here, it is instructive to experiment with the various constructions that may be placed on L subscript S and L subscript O For example, one can think of L subscript S as L sim, reflecting its self-simulative, telecrecursive aspect, and of LO as L out, the output of this self-simulation. Okay, that's helpful. One can associate LO, L out, the output, with observable states and distributed deterministic state transition syntax, and LS with the metasyntactic telic principle. Okay. That's sim, self-simulative. Okay. One can even think of LS and LO as respectively internal and partially external to SCSPL syntactic operators, and thus as loosely correspondent to the subjective and objective aspects of reality. Okay, I like that. That's nice. Where LS and LO are associated with the coherent inner expansion and decoherent requantization phases of conspansion. Okay, so the simulation as coherent inner expansion and the output as the decoherent requantization phase of conspansion. So then are subjective and objective reality. Simulation and output, wave and particle. In other words, the subjective-objective distinction along with complementarity can be viewed as functions of conspansive duality. All right, interesting. So that kind of provided a little bit of light for that. The fact that L subscript O, L out, has a foliated structure consisting of space-like sheets with temporal rules confined to the operators embedded in the sheets suggests that its interoperator, state-wise, ectosyntactic, level of structure be regarded as essentially spatial in character. Thus, where space denotes the external relationships among operators and time denotes their internal self-relationships, one might also think of LS and LO as corresponding approximately to time and space. Okay, yeah, because on the subjective level, that's denoting changes within the subject, registering as the objective changes, and the objective changes themselves directly rendering as spatial informational relationships. Okay, that makes sense. I like that. The corresponding is approximate because LS and LO are mutually inclusive, reflecting the logical coupling of space and time. LO topologically contains LO-LS structured operators, while the operators descriptively contain LO. I feel like a really, really, maybe slightly profane way to dumb this down would be like they're mutually inclusive because it would occur within the subject or the soul or the teller. The objective reality is also within that subject, so to speak. Where space and time respectively correspond to information and a combination of generalized cognition and telic recursion, one may therefore conclude that the conspansive evolution of spacetime is an alternation of teleocognitive and informational phases, cross-refined by telic recursion involving extended trans-Markovian telonic relationships. Okay. Although it contains the observable aspect of SCSPL, LO may in principle contain hidden, inobservable parameters implicated by nomological relationships and therefore relevant to physical state, i.e., in addition to the standard dynamical variables of physics, LO may contain additional dynamical variables that cannot be directly observed, but only theoretically inferred on the basis of more or less general observations. For example, string theorists, M-theorists, and others often conjecture that the universe may be floating in some sort of external embedding space, its relationship to which yields explanatory value regarding the internal state or condition of the universe itself. SCSPL conspansive duality suggests that the putative externality of such a space is not a meaningful property. If such a space exists and is sufficiently relevant to the universe in which we live to be of explanatory value to us, then it is by definition an ingredient of SCSPL syntax and can therefore be regarded as residing within SCSPL syntactic operators. In fact, this is a direct consequence of the reality principle. Although it would be possible to go on at length, this paper is intended to present a general outline of the theory rather than an exhaustive development. In conjunction with the principles and features enumerated above, the given framework should suffice to characterize SCSPL on an introductory basis and distinguish it in favor and content from other theories. Okay, let's see. All right, so we only have 2 more sections. So I think like the last 5 or so pages are basically blank, but okay. SCSPL as the self-excited circuit. We are now in a position to draw a few parallels between Wheeler's vision of reality theory and the CTMU. The self-excited circuit, the informational logic loop through which physics engenders observer participation, which engenders information, which engenders physics, is a tight characterization of SCSPL. So tight that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to replace SCSPL with anything else and neither violate nor fall short of Wheeler's description. SCSPL is logical in construction, has a loop-like dynamic, and creates information and syntax, including the laws of physics. It sounds like a self-excited circuit, for sure. Through telic recursion generated by agent-level syntactic operators whose acts of observer participation are essential to the self-configuration of the participatory universe. These acts are linked by telic recursion to the generalized cognitive perceptual interactions of quantum-level syntactic operators, the minimal events comprising the fabric of spacetime. And I forgot, Mal, if you want to hop in, you can.
Well, you've started, so I'll hop in at the next page.
Okay,
because also I was reading a bit ahead, and hence I'll stop at that page.
Okay,
Because
cool.
I'm reading fast and then taking like mental breaks, because just like the Parmenides, there's no way I can keep my focus here on
Right.
100%. I feel like I'm whipping myself, to be honest. It's like torture,
Yeah.
but it's important.
It's pretty good stuff, but it's definitely something that should be revisited, and anyone listening to this should probably go ahead and read it themselves. I think you definitely cognize information differently when you hear someone else read it against reading it yourself. And also if you take notes and kind of revisit things and cross-reference things.
If I give my opinion, at least, what would probably be ideal, because I've done this before with other texts, if you're listening to this, right, which would be go through, attached works, comments on this work, perhaps Christopher Langan interviews where he explains the topics, go through that, then revisit the work. So you have extra knowledge, you've read it once, and then you know what's in there, but you have new ways to look at it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely watch some of Chris Langan's interviews. He has a Facebook group where he'll answer questions pretty frequently. If you go in there and you're respectful, there's a good chance that he'll answer your questions. There's a wiki, and there's a lot of content from Chris himself as far as like interviews are concerned. But all right, continuing from there. Through telic feedback, state and syntax are cross-refined from unbound telesis, or UBT, a zero information domain of ontological potential, under the guidance of a higher order law called the telic principle, a protean law without law, through which order is extracted from disorder as laws are configured according to the generalized utility of state syntax relationships for agent-level operators or observer participants. The binary yes or no indications prescribed by it from bit are demanded by infocognitive monism and the fundamental status of two-valued sentential logic in SCSPL syntax. The world is not merely a cybernetic monstrosity, a giant machine ruled by pre-established laws, but a meta-cybernetic system with logical priority over machines and the laws they obey. How come existence is answered by the fact that the universe is a global SCSPL operator amounting to one vast self-selective, self-expressive act of reflexive observer participation, while how come the quantum is answered by the hological self-replication of the universe in each one of its microscopic syntactic operators and agent-level tellers. Yeah, those both make sense. Many observer participants yield one coherent world because, through the multiplex unity principle, the universe relates to its contents as a homogeneous, distributed syntax that syndifyonically supports and expresses their distinctions, even as they help it evolve through observer participation and telerecursion. So I've actually made a video about this specifically. Why do different subjects share one world? And pretty similar to this, what I say is because the conditions they're inhabiting that are defining themselves and their world are by definition relative to other conditions, which I guess in more CTMU terms would be states of information that a teller is involving itself with and inhabiting. So if you're going to do that, inhabit a particular state of information or condition, as I put it, you're going to be relative to other conditions, therefore you will share a world. And that's why, like, taking idealism to the kind of cutting edge kind of overrides solipsism. Oh, and actually I didn't even see this. Okay. Where did I leave off? Individual solipsism, I didn't even see that, damn, becomes distributed solipsism through the mutual absorption of SCSPL syntactic operators made possible by a combination of distributed SCSPL syntax and shared teleology. Yeah. So that's a little more fundamental than what I said, because there's prior syntax that would be inherited mutually and not just by one subject, for example. And if the increasing particularization of that syntax, or I guess products of that syntax, yields, well, particularity kind of increases at the same time as plurality increases, then it would make sense a little bit more by default that there is a plurality or a distributed solipsism, which is just idealism. Or it's monistic idealism, I should say. Anyways, that's good stuff. The reality principle, along with the metaphysical ontology principle and mind equals reality and other logical guarantors of cosmic self-containment, show that the syntactic stability of reality rules out any infinite reptilian regress of turtle on turtle, while the familiar continuum of classical physics corresponds to a syntactic LMS interpolation of the conspansive manifold generated by discrete SCSPL grammatical operations, where space and time correspond to information and generalized cognition respectively, and where information and cognition are logically entwined in infocognitive SCSPL, syntactic operators intersecting in states and state transition events, space and time are entwined in a conspansive event lattice connected by syntax and evolving through mutual absorption events among syntactic operators. Symmetric instances of generalized observation influenced by telerecursion. Thus, time is not fed into the explanation of existence, but is a function of conspansive telerecursive SCSPL grammar. Yeah. So time, not as a principle or an arche, no arche of time, but rather a consequence of something that probably does have an arche. The operation is at least rooted in something principally real, but in itself is not principally real. So in a way it might as well be, because it's implied by what is principally real. Same with space, but still should not be reified. The ultimate boundary of the universe is UBT, a realm of zero constraint and infinite possibility where neither boundary nor content exists. The super-tautologically closed universe buys internal diffionesis, specifically diffionesis, only at the price of global synesis. So internal difference at the price of global sameness. Purchasing its informational distinctions only at the price of coherence. I had a thought the other day that the boundaries of somebody's particular soul are basically the level at which they decohere with other states. So that's very good. No question, no answer reflects the fact that reality consists not of mere information, but infocognition. And that infocognition, or and that information on state is crucially linked to and dependent on syntax. The syntax of the questions asked of itself by the self-configuring universe. Due to the self-configurative freedom inherited by reality from UBT, the dynamically self-configuring universe displays uncertainty and complementarity and thus cannot be locked into locally determinative answers for all possible questions at once, while the extended self-connectivity of expansive spacetime unavoidably implicates the environment in the Q&A. And that was way up. Wait, no, it's not. That's referring to this, but all of these were kind of referred to closer to the beginning. And now he's kind of going over why the CTMU is just satisfies all of these very well. The super Copernican principle reflects the distribution of the creation event over every point of space-time according to the extended superposition principle, which describes the way consequent states and events are atemporally superposed in their antecedent states and events. Okay. Generalized consciousness, the unitary reflexivity of the universe, is a fair description of the self-configuration and self-processing capacity of SCSPL as captured by the telic and mind equals reality principles, while expansive spacetime links spatially and temporally distant objects in a web of contact and communication exceeding even the neural connectivity of a brain. And the CTMU describes the universe as just the sort of complex, teleologically self-variegating, self-synthesized information system prescribed by Moore's different. Telic recursively explicating multiplicity and diffunesis from the unity and synesis of distributed SCSPL syntax. The unique CTMU counterpart of what has sometimes been called the implicate order. And I'm really liking how this is kind of making a lot of the content we've been going over a lot more comprehensible. It's very good. The above analogy is only partial. It is nowhere implied that the current presentation is without its gaps. But in fairness, several crucial points can be made in favor of the CTMU even at this early stage of exposition. First, it is super tautological, being constructed to mirror logical tautology up to the level of model theory and beyond. It is true in much the same way that a theory of pure mathematics would be true, but with reference to an expanded universe consisting of both mathematical and physical reality. Indeed, the CTMU can be viewed as a theory of the mathematical structure of a new mathematical object, the SCSPL. Second, it has considerably more explanatory scope than other theories, providing a framework that is capable of accommodating the logic of self-determinative cosmogony without prejudicially excluding, e.g., subjective and non-material aspects of reality. Third, it largely embeds current models of reality, at least to the extent that these models have not already been pushed beyond their explanatory capacities. And fourth, it has what appears to be empirically valid implications absent from other theories except as assumptions or unexpected observations, e.g., accelerating cosmic expansion. But perhaps the most important thing at this point is that, in principle, any apparent explanatory gaps can be filled. That is, if something can be explained within the realm of standard science, then it can be even better explained in an inclusive model fortified with expansive duality. The ramifications of the CTMU are sufficiently extensive that their issuance from a single theory also demands an explanation of its own. The scientific, mathematical, and philosophical implications of the CTMU are many and varied, running the gamut from basic physics and cosmology to evolutionary biology, the theory of cognition, the foundations of mathematics, and the philosophies of language and consciousness. But to be fair, nothing less is to be expected of a true reality theory, particularly one that takes the form of a description of the relationship between mind and the universe. After all, the CTMU is named so because it is a symmetric cross-interpretation of mental and physical reality, logically mapping the concrete universe into an abstract theory of generalized cognition and vice versa according to the M equals R principle. Were its implications anything less than profound, it would be miscategorized and misnamed. The CTMU says that reality is a language, a self-explanatory, self-theorizing, self-modeling structure identical to the universe. As such, it can be regarded as a limit or contraction of model theory in which theory and universe coincide on the syntactic level of theoretical structure. Whereas most scientific theories are hopefully mapped into or onto the universe across an unbridgeable dualistic gulf, like the Leibniz gap. Wait, no, never mind. The CTMU is a monic theory. Well, it's kind of related to the Leibniz gap. Anyways, the CTMU is a monic theory of perception that simply eliminates the gulf by tautologically injecting logic in its entirety, including logical extensions of model theory and logic of formalized theories, into reality as distributed self-transductive syntax. The CTMU is able to do this because it is a hard mathematical fact that anything which does not conform to the syntax of logic is inconsistent and therefore not a part of any stable, coherent reality. Because the reality we inhabit is visibly stable and coherent, the correctness of this move is assured. By eliminating the theory-universe gulf on the level of cognitive and perceptual syntax, the CTMU admirably fulfills the criterion of theoretic economy, and supertautologically at that. Does the CTMU qualify as a realization of Wheeler's vision, and is it alone in this distinction? While one naturally hesitates to put words into the mouth of an icon, one or both of the things seems to be true. Either relatively few reality theorists are inclined to share Wheeler's far-reaching worldview, or relatively few reality theorists are able to understand his worldview and pursue its implications. Consequently, despite Wheeler's eminence as a physicist, his has almost seemed a voice in the wilderness, leaving some with the impression that his deepest speculations have more the ring of distant prophecy than immediate theoretical practicality. But while the questions, no's, and clues in terms of which Wheeler describes his vision may occasionally appear heavier on intuition and creativity than on logical and mathematical rigor, they are just the sort of intuitive distillations of mathematical insight that one might expect from one so experienced in logical and quantitative reasoning. In conjunction with other necessary principles, they can be transformed into logical mathematical properties of reality with enough restrictive power among them to determine a new mathematical structure called SCSPL, the ultimate intrinsic language. When all is said and done, there are excellent reasons to believe that this structure is unique, and that any additional principles that Professor Wheeler might have in mind can be accommodated by the CTMU as surely as by logic itself. All right. You want to pick up here, Mal?
Once again, I am off tune, so I would have to request you continue to read.
All right.
My apologies.
No problem. Let's go ahead and take a quick peek. Oh, yeah. All right. So we have a bit here. We're not going to read the addendum or the notes, but we have... Oh, did I just... Okay, yeah. So we got like 2 pages here. Okay, the CTMU and intelligent design. Design theory, which traces its origins to traditional theological arguments from design, holding that nature was more or less obviously designed by a pre-existing intelligence, maintains that the observed complexity of biological structures implies the involvement of empirically detectable intelligent causes in nature. Intelligent design is the most recent scientific outgrowth of design theory, is a scientific research program based on a more philosophically neutral and therefore scientific search for instances of a clear, objective standard form of biological complexity. According to William Dembski, one of the movement's leading spokesmen, this has led to a theory of biological origins and development, according to which intelligent and empirically detectable causes are necessary to explain the complex, information-rich structures of biology. In view of the informational nature of complexity, Dembski observes that information is not reducible to natural causes. The origin of information is best sought in intelligent causes. Intelligent design, thereby, becomes a theory for detecting and measuring information, explaining its origin, and tracing its flow. One of the first things to note about the above definition is that it couples the implied definitions of intelligence, causation, and information to a greater extent than do most dictionaries, pointing in principle to a joint definition of all of them. Since any good definition requires a model, one might be strongly tempted to infer on this basis that ID, as identified here, or as here defined, has a well-defined model in which all of its constituent concepts are related. It may therefore come as a surprise to many that perhaps the most frequent, or at any rate the most general, objection to ID, intelligent design, in the wider intellectual community is that it has no model. According to its critics, it lacks any real-world interpretation specifying a fundamental medium able to support it or a means by which to realize it. Furthermore, its critics claim its central hypothesis is not only beyond proof, but unrealistic and not amenable to empirical confirmation. In all fairness, it must be noted that insofar as science has itself specularly failed to agree on a global model of reality, this is nothing more than an exercise in hypocrisy. Science observes, relates, and extrapolates from observations with what often turns out to be great efficiency, but has time and time again proven unable to completely justify its reductions or the correspondences between its theories and the real universe as a whole. Although some critics claim that beyond a certain point, explanation is pointless and futile, they do not speak for science. The entire purpose of science is explanation, not rationally unsubstantiated assertions to the effect that a closed-form explanation is unavailable or unnecessary. In seeking a coherent explanation for existence, an explanation incorporating an ontological design phase that is rational, coherent, and therefore intelligent, the intelligent design program is in fact perfectly consistent with science. However, being perfectly consistent with science means merely that something is in line for a model, not that it already has one. It has thus been possible for dedicated critics of identity theory, or intelligent design, to create the illusion, at least for sympathetic audiences, that they have it at a critical disadvantage. They contend that while science must be instrumental to society, yield specific predictions, and thus cite specific structural and dynamical laws that non-trivially explain its contexts of application, intelligent design is nothing more than a Trojan horse for religious ideology, makes no non-trivial predictions, and is devoid of theoretical structure. Due to the number of sympathetic ears that such claims have found in academia, this illusion has all but promoted itself to the status of a self-reinforcing mass delusion in certain closed-minded sectors of the intellectual community. Obviously, it would be to the advantage of the intelligent design movement and society as a whole to end this contagion by putting forth something clearly recognizable as a model. The problem, of course, is that as long as science in general lacks a fundamental model, so do all particular strains of science, including intelligent design. Due to the close connection between fundamentality and generality, intelligent design or any other field of scientific inquiry would ultimately have to provide science in general with a fundamental model in order to provide one for itself. This might have led some people, in particular those who doubt the existence of a stable fundamental model of reality, to suppose that the intelligent design controversy would remain strictly within the realm of philosophy until the end of time. But this is not the case. For if there were really no fundamental model, if there were no way to map theoretic cognition onto reality in its entirety, perception itself would lack a stable foundation. Perception, after all, can be described as the modeling of objective reality in cognition, and the modeling of cognition in objective reality. The self-evident perceptual stability of reality on which the existence and efficacy of science and scientific methodology absolutely depend bear unshakable testimony to the existence of a fundamental model of the real universe. The general nature of this model can be glimpsed merely by considering the tautological reflexivity of the term self-evident. Anything that is self-evident proves or evidences itself, and any construct that is implicated in its own proof is tautological. Indeed, insofar as observers are real, perception amounts to reality tautologically perceiving itself. The logical ramifications of this statement are developed in the supertautological CTMU. according to which the model in question coincides logically and geometrically, syntactically and informationally with the process of generating the model, i.e., with generalized cognition and perception. Information thus coincides with information transduction, and reality is a tautological self-interpretive process evolving through SCSPL grammar. The CTMU has a meta-Darwinian message. The universe evolves by hological self-replication and self-selection. Furthermore, because the universe is natural, its self-selection amounts to a cosmic form of natural selection. But by the nature of this selection process, it also bears description as intelligent self-design. The universe is intelligent because this is precisely what it must be in order to solve the problem of self-selection, the master problem in terms of which all lesser problems are necessarily formulated. This is unsurprising, for intelligence itself is a natural phenomenon that could never have emerged in humans and animals were it not already a latent property of the medium of emergence. So on a Platinian note, nothing is affected that is not present in a cause, which is a very, very good point. Remember that. Write it down. An object does not displace its medium, but embodies it and thus serves as an expression of its underlying syntactic properties. What is far more surprising and far more disappointing is the ideological conflict to which this has led. It seems that one group likes the term intelligent but is indifferent or hostile to the term natural, while the other likes natural but abhors intelligent. In some strange way, the whole controversy seems to hinge on terminology. Of course, it can be credibly argued that the argument actually goes far deeper than semantics, that there are substantive differences between the two positions. For example, some proponents of the radical Darwinian version of natural selection insist on randomness, rather than design as an explanation for how new mutations are generated prior to the restrictive action of natural selection itself. Telic recursion as seeking to maximize general utility does make a ton of sense for natural selection. Randomness is a little bit silly. But anyways. Okay, but this is untenable, for in any traditional scientific context, randomness is synonymous with indeterminacy or acausality. And when all is said and done, acausality means just what it always has, magic. That is, something which exists without external or intrinsic cause, has been selected for and brought into existence by nothing at all of a causal nature, and is thus the sort of something from nothing proposition favored, usually through voluntary suspension of disbelief by frequenters of magic shows. The way I usually explain evolution in my model, the way I model metaphysics, is evolution via involution, which I think is very CTMU consistent. I'm sure I was probably subconsciously influenced by it, but states that are evolving due to the conditions that subjects involve themselves with, kind of like the self-objectification of those conditions as evolution, as a process. Anyways. Inexplicably, some of those taking this position nevertheless accuse of magical thinkers anyone proposing to introduce an element of teleological volition to fill the causal gap. Such parties might object that by randomness they mean not a causality but merely causal ignorance. However, if by taking this position they mean to belatedly invoke causality, then they are initiating a causal regress. Such a regress can take one of three forms. It can be infinite and open. It can terminate at a prime mover which itself has no causal explanation, or it can form some sort of closed cycle doubling as prime mover and that which is moved, like a prime self-mover. Thing about that is it wouldn't, for instance, take like a godhead, or take like a divine mind. It would be able to change states in which it like globally inhabits via its containment of like more local souls, but it wouldn't be able to change itself from being a divine mind into something else. So it's not, in a way it'd be a kind of self motion, but not like a true motion, I guess. But a prime mover has seemingly been ruled out by assumption, and an infinite open regress can be ruled out because of its lack of a stable recursive syntax, would make it impossible to form stable informational boundaries in terms of which to perceive and conceive of reality. What about the cyclical solution? If one uses laws to explain states, then one is obliged to explain the laws themselves. Standard scientific methodology requires that natural laws be defined on observations of states. If it is then claimed that all states are by definition caused by natural laws, then this constitutes a circularity necessarily devolving to a mutual definition of law and state. If it is then objected that this circularity characterizes only the process of science, but not the objective universe that science studies, and that laws in fact have absolute priority over states, then the laws themselves require an explanation by something other than state. But this would effectively rule out the only remaining alternative, namely the closed cycle configuration, and we would arrive again at magic. So this kind of reminds me of explaining, and it's a little bit different, but take like Plotinus's hypostases, because the preceding hypostases and their, each of them, their unique consequences, right? Because each is implied by the prior directly preceding it, its direct antecedent, you can kind of know the one, ironically, because I wasn't actually meaning the one hypostasis, via knowing the posterior in a way. Not that it should be reduced there too, but because it would be self-consistent. Anyways, not the exact same thing, but it reminded me of that, because you should be able to cast the state similarly back onto the law and know the law by the way it plays out, if that makes sense. It follows that the inherently subjective process of science cannot ultimately be separated from the objective universe. The universe must be self-defining by cross-refinement of syntax and state. This brings us back to the CTMU, which says that the universe and everything in it ultimately evolves by self-multiplexing and self-selection. In the CTMU, design and selection, generative and restrictive sides of the same coin, are dual concepts associated with the alternating stages of conspansion. The self-selection of reality is inextricably coupled to self-design, and it is this two-phase process that results in nature. Biological evolution is simply a reflection of the evolution of reality itself, a process of telic recursion mirroring that of the universe as a whole. Thus, when computations of evolutionary probability are regressively extrapolated to the distributed instant of creation, they inevitably arrive at a logical and therefore meaningful foundation. The CTMU says that on logical grounds, reality has generative and restrictive phases, and that evolution has generative and restrictive phases that are necessarily expressed in terms of those of reality. It asserts that the meta-cybernetic mechanism of evolution is telic recursion, an atemporal process which sets up a stratified dialectic between syntax and state, organism and environment, with mutually consistent mutable and invariant levels. It says that this process, though subject to various forms of noise, interference, and competition, predicated on the internal freedom of reality, tends to maximize the utility of the universe and its inhabitants. And it thus says that evolution is much more than a mere environmental dictatorship, in which inexplicable laws of nature call the tune as biology slavishly dances the jig of life and death. The CTMU says that by its self-generative, self-selective nature, which follows directly from the analytic requirement of self-containment, reality is its own designer. Other features of the generative grammar of reality imply that reality possesses certain logical properties traditionally regarded as theological or spiritual, and to this extent the self-designing aspect of reality is open to a theological or spiritual interpretation. The CTMU, being a logical theory, does not attempt to force such an interpretation down anyone's throat. Not all semantic permutations need affect theoretical structure. But what it does do, however, is render any anti-theological interpretation a priori false, and ensures that whatever interpretation one chooses accommodates the existence of an intelligent designer, namely reality itself. In light of the CTMU, this is now a matter more of logic than of taste. In any case, it should be clear that the CTMU yields new ways of looking at both evolution and teleology. Just as it is distinguished from other theories of cosmic evolution by its level of self-containment, particularly with regard to its preference for self-determinacy rather than external determinacy or indeterminacy, so for its approach to biological evolution. Unlike other theories, the CTMU places evolutionary biology squarely in the context of a fundamental, self-contained model of reality, thus furnishing it with an explanation and foundation of its own instead of irresponsibly passing the explanatory buck to some future reduction. Instead of counting it sufficient to model its evolutionary implications in the biological world, the CTMU establishes model theoretic symmetry by providing a seamless blend of theory and universe in which the biological world can itself be modeled by physical embedment. This alone entitles it to a place in the evolutionary debate. All right, so that's the end of the CTMU, save the acknowledgement, which, if anyone wants to pause and read, right there, and some notes, which we're not going to read through, but it might be helpful, but we're not going to do that. Anyone can do that on their own time or pause when I go over it, because it's just going to be kind of off of what we've already read. So, all right, does anybody have any comments, questions now that we're finished up? Well, don't get too off base, because we will hold an informal off or after this and talk about the next book and all that. So yeah, any CTMU comments, questions, concerns, praise, how your day went, Social Security? If not, that's okay. For the viewers, as we said earlier, a lot of this will be easier to understand. For one, if you go in yourself, well, listening will be helpful. But if you go in yourself and in another tab have the CTMU wiki ready, so you can just take the time to break down all of the neologisms and terminology, that would be helpful. The interviews are helpful because some interviewers are good at having Chris explain stuff in a little bit more accessible terms. And yeah, thank you for watching. If you want to join in on a different reading group, I'm going to be holding them most Saturdays, and we'll move on to something else after this. Thanks for watching. Take care.